secrets buried in dust, and whispers echoing through Rosewood Library. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Alexander. This community grows with every story shared, no matter where you're tuning in from. Your comments bring this mystery to life. Let's dive in. The summer sun fell with a mellow warmth over the village of Much Woodham, a place where nothing untoward ever seemed to occur, so the residents liked to tell themselves. Rosewood, the stately manor perched on the edge of the village, had thrown open its gates for the annual midsummer garden party. It was an event of chatter, sponge cakes, and lilac-scented breezes, where the old ivy-clad library of the house provided a dignified backdrop to tables laden with teapots and sandwiches. The library itself, with its tall mullioned windows, had long been a subject of whispered fascination. It contained rare books, family ledgers, and curious records that traced the lives of the Marchmont family, owners of Rosewood for generations. But today, it was only a setting, admired from afar as villagers mingled on the lawn, sipping tea from bone china cups. Miss Marple had been persuaded to attend by her old friend Mrs. Weatherby, who insisted that a breath of summer air would do her good. Sitting quietly beneath a parasol, knitting needles moving with unhurried precision, Miss Marple seemed a frail presence amid the cheerful commotion. Yet her pale blue eyes moved with alert interest, alighting upon groups of villagers whose conversations, gestures, and furtive glances revealed more than their polite words. It was, as Miss Marple well knew, in such gatherings that one might learn a great deal about human nature. The careless boast, the anxious silence, and the too hearty laugh. These were the small betrayals of character. At the far end of the lawn, Lady Marchmont, regal in lavender silk, greeted each guest with the composure of someone accustomed to hosting generations of villagers. Her nephew, Leonard Marchmont, a young man with slicked back hair and the kind of charm that appeared practiced rather than natural, hovered nearby, offering champagne to the more fashionable guests. Miss Marple noted how Lady Marchmont's smile never faltered, yet her eyes flickered toward Leonard with an unease she could not disguise. There was, too, the librarian, Mr. Ambrose Fennel, who had been in service at Rosewood Library for nearly 30 years. His stooped frame and spectacles gave him the air of a harmless bookworm, though his stiff manner suggested a man burdened with secrets. He seldom engaged in village gossip, and when he did, it was with a nervous glance over his shoulder, as though fearful that words might travel further than intended. The garden was filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Weatherby, of course, was busily refilling cups, her voice carrying over the music of the string quartet. Reverend Pritchard, always eager to sermonize, even at social events, was deep in conversation with Miss Lydia Gray, a young woman with aspirations of writing a novel set, as she proclaimed, within the very walls of Rosewood Library. Captain Ellison, a retired army officer, stood apart with his cane, regarding the younger guests with stern disapproval. For a while, it was all harmless chatter, the sort of event where nothing more dramatic than a wasp in the jam pot might be expected. And yet, just as the bells of St. Mary's Church struck 4, a sudden commotion broke the afternoon's tranquility. It began with the sound of shattering glass from the direction of the library. Heads turned sharply and cups rattled upon their saucers. Leonard Marchmont was the first to dash across the lawn, flinging open the side door of the house. A murmur rippled through the guests, speculation already blooming before facts had been established. Miss Marple, knitting set aside, rose slowly, her expression unreadable. She walked with quiet dignity toward the open doorway, observing how some guests craned their necks with unseemly eagerness, while others instinctively withdrew, as though fearful of being drawn into whatever unpleasantness awaited. Inside the library, the heavy air smelled of dust and parchment. Sunlight slanted through fractured glass, glittering across the oak-paneled walls. And there, sprawled across the carpet in front of a toppled chair, lay the motionless figure of Ambrose Fennel, The librarian. His spectacles were cracked beside him, his eyes staring upward in a vacant expression of shock. Lady Marchmont gasped, her gloved hand rising to her lips. Leonard, pale but composed, crouched beside the body. "He's dead," he announced unnecessarily, his tone oddly flat. Captain Ellison stumped forward. "Looks like a seizure or a fall." "Poor devil," he muttered, though his eyes narrowed at the broken window where shards of glass still clung precariously to the frame. Miss Marple's gaze followed him. A small, curious detail caught her attention, something so ordinary that no one else seemed to notice. She said nothing, only clasped her hands lightly before her, as though in prayer. The Reverend was already murmuring about the uncertainty of life, while Mrs. Weatherby fanned herself with a handkerchief, torn between horror and the thrill of having something truly shocking to recount at tea. Lydia Gray whispered something about the tragic inspiration this might provide for her novel, earning a sharp rebuke from Lady Marchmont. "Please," Lady Marchmont said with authority, "someone fetch the doctor." And the police. Within the hour, Inspector Crail of the County Constabulary arrived, his stout figure and ruddy cheeks lending him the air of a man who had eaten more pork pies than he had solved crimes. He listened gravely to Leonard's account, nodding with the solemnity of one determined to appear competent before the gathered gentry. "A regrettable incident," he said at last, "but accidents will happen." Miss Marple, who had listened without intrusion, bent briefly over the body before straightening with a slight shake of her head. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said softly, "but I rather think Mr. Fennel did not fall. He was struck." The words fell like a stone into the silence of the library. Several guests gasped. Lady Marchmont swayed as though she might faint. Inspector Crail cleared his throat, visibly flustered. "And what makes you say that, madam?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her voice mild as ever. "Only a little thing, Inspector. A very little thing indeed. But I believe you will find it points in quite a different direction than mere accident." And with that, the course of the affair at Rosewood Library was set in motion, an affair that would draw forth the hidden truths of much Woodham, unravel reputations, and test the quiet but unyielding powers of Miss Marple. The morning after the garden party rose clear and deceptively cheerful over much Woodham, a village that preferred its excitement to be strictly horticultural. Yet by 8 o'clock, before the bell at St. Mary had tolled the hour, the news had already threaded itself through hedgerow and lane. Ambrose Fennel, the librarian at Rosewood, had been found dead on the carpet, and Miss Marple, who rarely wasted a sentence, had told the inspector that it was not an accident. Gossip requires a hearth, and in much Woodham the first hearth belonged to Mrs. Chittenden's bakery, where the morning queue formed like a parish in miniature. Mrs. Chittenden herself, soft-voiced and keen-eared, handed loaves across the counter with the air of a woman for whom a scandal was a sort of yeast. It made everything rise. "I told my Arthur," she confided, as Reverend Pritchard accepted a poppy seed roll that he did not remember ordering. "I told him there was something not right about Mr. Fennel lately. Pale as parchment he was, always looking over his shoulder, like a man who's lent a book to the wrong person." Reverend Pritchard cleared his throat with a gravity he enjoyed. "We must refrain from conjecture, Mrs. Chittenden." He paused, adopting a tone of judicious sorrow. "Yet it is true the Lord uses even tragedies to remind us of the fleeting nature of life." "Fleeting, yes," said Mrs. Chittenden, undeterred. "But some people's nature is more slippery than others, begging your reverence." Near the door, Captain Ellison's cane thumped against flagstone. He received his usual slice of seed cake with a curt nod, his mind returning, as it often did in moments of disquiet, to matters of discipline and order. A man who died in a library inside a great house, with its windows to the lawn, should have died for reasons that could be named and written down. He disliked untidiness. Between the bakery and the post office lay a narrow triangle of green where, that morning, Lydia Gray settled on a bench with a notebook on her knees. She was 26, determined, and in love with notions of herself adjusting spectacles at literary gatherings. The death at Rosewood had lit her imagination like a match in a dark cupboard. She wrote a line and crossed it out. The librarian fell like a broken marionette beneath the latticed gaze of history. Then she tried again, sensing that phrases sounded truer once they had been overheard by someone else. "Awful business," said young Peter Jupp, the Marchmont's undergardener, tugging his cap with an awkward hand as he passed. "Awful. They say there was glass everywhere from a window." Lydia rested her pencil. "And what else do they say?" Peter coloured. "Only that Mr. Fennel had words with Mr. Leonard last week about the ledger, books being lent that shouldn't be. That's what Mrs. Bunn told my mum, and Mrs. Bunn has the sweeping of the library." Lydia filed this, as she filed everything, for later embellishment. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby stood with a bundle of letters bound by a blue ribbon. She had slept poorly, her pillow tossed by unease. It would not do, she thought, to let matters rest with Inspector Crale's vague talk of seizures and accidents. And yet she could hear his voice, even now, booming with the assurance of a man who trusted his own routine. "I shall write to my sister," she announced to Miss Pole, who was admiring penny stamps, "and tell her that, as I have always suspected, one must never discount an internal organ at our age. The most dreadful things transpire quite soundlessly. One minute a man is shelving books, the next, well, Miss Pole, who adored Miss Marple in theory but dreaded her in practice, leaned in. "But you were there when Miss Marple spoke, were you not?" She said he was struck. Struck, Mrs. Weatherby. Mrs. Weatherby found herself both pleased and unsettled to be thus reminded. She did speak, yes, though you know Jane. She says a thing not to shock, but because it is the only sensible thing to say. And if she says Mr. Fennel was struck, then in all likelihood he was. As if summoned by that calm statement, Miss Marple herself appeared at the corner, a small figure in a straw hat, pausing to admire the morning glories spilling over the postmistress's fence. She inclined her head to the two ladies with her usual blend of mildness and mischief. "How quickly news transforms itself," she observed. "Yesterday it was a broken window and a toppled chair. Today it has grown to motives and menacing strangers. By tea-time, perhaps, we shall have a confession in the vestry." Mrs. Weatherby squeezed her arm. "You will not be cross if I say I'm glad you told the inspector your thoughts. It requires a steady hand to place a fact where everyone can see it. You always had that hand." "My dear," said Miss Marple, "I only noticed a little thing. Little things are often the least welcome. They require one to give up the comfort of a story one has already begun to enjoy." From the high drive at Rosewood, Lady Marchmont watched a constable bicycle away toward the village. She felt curiously hollow, as if the sound of shattering glass had knocked out a panel within her. In the breakfast room, Leonard was stirring his coffee as though its surface concealed an answer. "They will find nothing," he said, not looking up. "Crale is very firm on the point that Mr. Fennel was not in the best of health. And you know how villagers improve a tale by telling it twice." Lady Marchmont rested her fingertips on the tablecloth, seeing how the faint tremor of her hand disturbed a pattern of rosebuds. And yet Miss Marple thought otherwise. Leonard's smile flickered. "Miss Marple is famous for it. People rather insist she should find something. It is almost a kindness to oblige." "Kindness," said Lady Marchmont, "is not the word that comes to mind." She rose, making a decision she had avoided since Michael Marchmont's death 3 years before, leaving her in charge of the old house and all its obligations. "I shall receive Miss Marple at 11, if she can bear to come. She will want to see the library again. And perhaps, Leonard, you will remember that we owe the village a duty of openness. Mr. Fennel was in our service." Leonard put down his spoon with care. I shall remember. Inspector Crail came at 10:30, full of a robust skepticism that had survived many assaults by other people's certainties. He stood in the library amid the ministerial odour of polished wood. A pane in the mullioned window had been boarded, and a dull rectangle caught the light. On the desk lay a stack of record cards, a blotting pad, and a heavy brass paperweight in the form of a sleeping lion. Crail glanced about. The chairs were upright again, and the rug had been straightened. Even the cracked spectacles had been carried away by Dr. Hadley after making a tutting sound about age and arteries. The place looked as if it had prepared to resume its serious work. "Well," Crail said to Constable Reed, "nothing to see. Chap likely fainted and knocked himself on the corner there. Sharp edge, that." Reed, who had been reared to mistrust the easy explanation, nevertheless respected his superior's appetite for one. "Yes, sir." "And all this talk about the broken glass," Crail went on, "when there's a perfectly good explanation for it. A guest. Those old windows are temperamental. Or some child's ball. They were on the lawn, weren't they? People come and go. He did not notice that the ledge of the inner sill was dusted with a pale bloom that had not been disturbed by any foot or hand. Nor was he troubled by the fact that if a pane had been broken by something hurled from outside, more glass would have lain on the stone path beneath the window. He had seen glass before. It always looked the same to him, and that satisfied a need he had. At 11 precisely, Miss Marple was shown into the library by Mrs. Bunn, who treated her with a reverent briskness reserved for women who made sense of muddles. Lady Marchmont greeted her with a stricken courtesy. "How very good of you to come," she said. "I find that when something singular occurs in a house one knows too well, one becomes blind on almost every point. Perhaps you may see what I cannot." Miss Marple's eyes wandered, gentle and exact, from shelf to shelf. Books have expressions. She often thought some are loved, some are feared, some are read to tatters, and some are not to be touched without permission. She paused beside the desk, where a fan of record cards lay like a small paper-coloured wing. "I remember Mr. Fennel's way with these," she murmured, almost to herself. "He kept them as a gardener keeps seedlings protectively. It is a curious person who would slide one beneath a chair leg to cure a wobble." Lady Marchmont glanced at the chair. "Was it done?" "It was yesterday," Miss Marple said, and her voice, though mild, acquired a certain firmness. Only for a moment, perhaps. "The chair was upright when we re-entered. One notices silly housekeeping things at my age." Lady Marchmont said nothing. The detail, small and abject, nonetheless made the hair stir at the back of her neck. As they spoke, Leonard entered in a grey suit that made him look younger than his worries. He greeted Miss Marple with smooth kindness, then drifted to the shelves like a man measuring the distance between himself and memory. "You will think us very foolish," he said, smiling. "Rosewood has never had a death in its library before. We are at sea." "Not foolish at all," said Miss Marple. "Only humans. It is uncomfortable to find that a room one uses for quiet things can be rearranged so abruptly." He laughed then, a trifle too brightly. "Well, yes, the world tends to rearrange itself without asking." When Miss Marple took her leave 20 minutes later, she walked the long drive in the warm sunlight, her parasol just touching the tips of the beeches as a breeze wandered through. She did not look back, but she thought of the brass paperweight of the sleeping lion and how yesterday it had not been sleeping where it ought. Over luncheon in her cottage, she told only the cat what she had not told the inspector, that the pane had been broken from within, not without, that the inner sill had held its bloom of dust like a child's cheek holds flour, that a tiny thread of lavender silk had clung yesterday to the carved arm of the toppled chair, and that Lady Marchmont, so impeccable, did not bustle near furniture when guests were shocked and raised voices. The cat, indifferent to clues, blinked with beatific greed as Miss Marple apportioned a scrap of haddock. She scolded herself gently for allowing the thread to trouble her more than it should. Threads in great houses belong to no one person. The house itself seemed to shed them. By late afternoon, the village had fitted the event with theories like hats. Captain Ellison favored an intruder who had blundered in among the rare books and been surprised by Mr. Fennel's righteous fury. Reverend Pritchard, with solemn relish, leaned toward an apoplexy made tragic by a careless stumble. Lydia Gray, whose notebook bristled with underlinings, preferred to whisper that a forbidden book had changed hands and that ideas could be more dangerous than knives. And Mrs. Weatherby, who had known Miss Marple since before such phrases were coined, thought, without quite admitting it to herself, that when Jane said "struck," she had not meant only a blow. She had meant the village itself, struck as a bell is struck, with each person's tone ringing out in turn. At dusk, when the sky thinned to a pale green and the rooks made their harsh negotiations above the avenue, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and considered the pattern of the day. Patterns, like people, persisted. Mr. Fennel had been a keeper of records. Keepers always knew who owed what to whom. A man like that drew gratitude, resentment, and fear. She remembered his stooped shoulders, the way his hand had hovered over the blotter as though it protected something more fragile than ink. There will be more talk tomorrow, and something else besides talk. Spin a ball of wool too tightly, and it would leap from the lap and go rolling beneath furniture, collecting dust and inconvenient truths until one must get down on hands and knees to fetch it. She smiled faintly. That was work for a younger back. But one did what one must. At 8:30 that evening, a letter slipped under Miss Marple's door. It was unremarkable in appearance, thin, cream, and addressed in a careful, slanted hand. Within lay a single sentence. No more, please, if you are the sort of lady who understands. Come to the library at 9 tomorrow before they open it. No signature, no flourish. The hour was early for visitors, and earlier for conspiracies. Miss Marple placed the note beneath the little china dish where she kept buttons that had outlived their garments. Very well, she said aloud, as if to the cat, who had arranged itself in a contented pretzel shape by the hearth. If someone wishes to show me how the library has rearranged itself, I think it would be unkind to keep them waiting. The cat flicked an air. Outside, the village quieted. Inside, the old clock on the mantel began to tick more loudly than usual, as clocks will when they sense they have been drafted into service. Much of Woodham slept on its half-answer, and Miss Marple, whose kindness extended even to the truth, prepared to rise earlier than her years would advise. The morning dawned cool and misty, the kind of morning that made the hedgerows glisten and the cobblestones of much Woodham seem older than the church itself. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, her movements measured as though she were preparing for an ordinary day. But the folded note still sat beneath the china dish on her mantel, and she treated it as one treats a curious seed that might, when planted, yield an unexpected bloom. By 8:45 she was walking up the avenue toward Rosewood, parasol in hand, though the sun had not yet shone. Itself. The mist curled low across the grass, softening the outline of the grand house. To one side, a rook cawed in the distance, the sound oddly mournful in the stillness. Few villagers stirred at such an hour, and those who did preferred to keep indoors until the day's gossip could be brewed along with the tea. Thus, Miss Marple found herself alone when she reached the side entrance to the library. The heavy oak door stood ajar, a wedge of pale light spilling across the stone step. Miss Marple tapped gently on the frame. No answer came. She pushed the door a little wider, her hand steady, and stepped inside. The library was hushed with that particular stillness belonging only to places where books are kept. Dust motes turned lazily in the faint beams of light that filtered through the tall windows. The chair where Ambrose Fennel had fallen had been righted, and the brass paperweight sat once again at the corner of the desk, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet something had happened, Miss Marple reminded herself. A man had died here, and though the inspector might prefer to call it natural, there was no natural reason why a pane of glass should shatter inward, or why record cards should be tucked where they did not belong. The room's attempts at order only deepened her unease. "Is that you, Miss Marple?" a voice whispered from the shadows. She turned to see Mrs. Bunn, the housemaid, wringing her hands. The woman's round face was flushed with nerves, and her apron, hastily tied, bore traces of flour as if she had left her duties in the kitchen to rush here. "Yes, Mrs. Bunn," Miss Marple said kindly. "I received a note. Was it from you?" Mrs. Bunn nodded, her eyes darting toward the door. "I couldn't put my name, ma'am. I dare not. But I saw something yesterday. Something I didn't tell the inspector. I was afraid." "Afraid of what, my dear?" Mrs. Bunn lowered her voice until it trembled. "Afraid of Master Leonard. It was him I saw arguing with Mr. Fennel last week, and it was him I saw, just before the window broke, standing near the desk with his hand on that paperweight. I swear it. But when I heard him laughing with the inspector after, saying it must have been poor Mr. Fennel's weak heart, I thought, who would believe me against the master of the house?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "People believe all sorts of things, Mrs. Bunn. Sometimes it is not a question of belief, but of noticing what fits where it should not. Thank you for telling me." The maid seemed relieved merely to have spoken, but she pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. "I don't want trouble, ma'am. Rosewood is my place. I've nowhere else to go." "No one is looking to cast you out," Miss Marple said softly. "We are only looking to understand what happened. Sometimes truth is the only kindness left to offer." Before Mrs. Bunn could reply, footsteps echoed in the hall. She scurried off, leaving Miss Marple once again alone. The door opened to admit Inspector Crail, stout and ruddy as ever, his mustache bristling with suspicion. "Well, well," he said, eyeing Miss Marple. "I might have guessed. Couldn't resist another look, eh?" Miss Marple folded her hands demurely. "One likes to tidy away puzzles, Inspector, just as one tidies knitting. A dropped stitch always troubles me." Crail gave a short laugh, though without humor. "Dropped a stitch, did you? I'll tell you what troubles me about a village full of idle tongues. Already they've got the poor fellow murdered with poison, stabbed in the back and pushed out of the window all at once. Nonsense. Gossip seldom bothers with probability," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But I should think you'd prefer a neat answer rather than a confused one." "My neat answer," Crail replied firmly, "is that the man overexerted himself, fainted, and struck his head on the desk. The window went in the same moment, whether by a stumble or a gust. Simple." Miss Marple inclined her head as though accepting the inevitability of his reasoning, though her eyes lingered on the sill where the fine layer of dust still clung. Crail, oblivious, moved to the desk and plucked at the brass paperweight with careless fingers. "Solid bit of metal," he said. "Good for holding down papers in a drafty room, eh?" "Or for other purposes," Miss Marple murmured. The inspector glanced at her, narrowing his eyes. "You've a way of saying things, madam, that makes them sound cleverer than they are. Leave the policing to me." She smiled serenely, offering no argument. Arguments were seldom useful. Truth had a way of revealing itself without them. By midday, the village was abuzz again. At the grocer's, Mrs. Chittenden insisted she had heard Mr. Fennel once threaten to reveal a scandal in the Marchmont family accounts. At the vicarage, Reverend Pritchard solemnly warned his curate against the sins of envy, citing the librarian's sharp tongue and secretive ways. Lydia Gray, meanwhile, had written 2 entire chapters of her novel, recasting Ambrose Fennel as a tragic martyr whose knowledge of forbidden manuscripts led to his untimely death. Everyone, it seemed, had a theory, and none of them aligned. Miss Marple listened with quiet amusement at the fragments of conversation drifting through the lanes, her mind sifting the words like flour through a sieve. Among the wild speculation, there were grains worth keeping. That afternoon, she returned briefly to Rosewood at Lady Marchmont's request. The lady of the house looked drawn, her eyes shadowed. "I cannot make sense of it, Miss Marple," she confessed. "Ambrose was a quiet man, dull perhaps, but not troublesome, and yet now he has left us in this state of uproar." "Quiet men often see more than they are meant to," Miss Marple replied gently. "It is sometimes a dangerous gift." Leonard entered midway through their conversation, his charm worn like armor. "Are we still at this?" he exclaimed. The man had a weak constitution. "Why must we spin tales about conspiracies?" Lady Marchmont gave him a reproachful glance. "Because a man lies dead in our library, Leonard, it is not the same as if a vase had broken." Miss Marple watched the exchange without comment, though she noted how Leonard's hands never seemed to rest, drumming against his trousers or brushing at invisible specks of dust. Guilt was not always so easily seen, but restlessness spoke in its own language. As she left Rosewood, Miss Marple encountered Captain Ellison leaning on his cane by the gates. He greeted her with a curt nod. "Well, Miss Marple, what do you make of it all?" "I make sure that there are many explanations, Captain," she replied. "But only one will fit as it should." He harumphed. "The lad, Leonard, is too smooth by half." "Mark my words, smoothness covers rot." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it merely covers fear." That evening, in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The yarn slipped between her fingers as her mind replayed the morning's events. Mrs. Bunn's whispered confession, the inspector's obstinate certainty, Lady Marchmont's tremor, and Leonard's restless hands. All these threads, loose and frayed, waited to be woven into a pattern. And patterns, she knew well, never lied. As she set down her needles, a knock sounded at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Lydia Gray standing there, her cheeks flushed, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "I thought you should know," Lydia said breathlessly. "Someone has been going through Mr. Fennell's things at the library. His desk papers have been disturbed. I saw it this afternoon when I lingered after Lady Marchmont left, and one of the record cards is missing, the one with Leonard's name on it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, though her tone remained calm. "How curious," she said. "A missing card. That is often the sort of thing that tells one the most." She invited Lydia inside, setting the kettle to boil. Outside, the evening deepened into silence, and the village, still restless with rumors, prepared for another night of uncertainty. But within Miss Marple's sitting room, the puzzle grew sharper, each piece falling into place with quiet inevitability. Something more was stirring at Rosewood Library, and before long, the village would find itself caught in a web far more intricate than gossip could ever weave. By the third day after Ambrose Fennell's death, the air in Much Woodham seemed charged with unease, as if the village itself sensed that the quiet order of things had been overturned. People gathered in twos and threes at doorways, shop counters, and garden gates, their voices lowered, yet full of eager insistence. All agreed on one point, that the affair at Rosewood Library had become a matter for the police to solve. And in the absence of facts, suspicion had begun to settle like dust upon the nearest and most obvious target, Leonard Marchmont. Inspector Crail himself appeared in no hurry to question other possibilities. His broad back could be seen moving up and down the Marchmont Drive at least twice that morning, his notebook clutched in one hand and a pencil jutting from behind his ear. To him, Leonard's quarrel with Mr. Fennell, coupled with the whispered accounts of his temper, made for a tidy conclusion. Leonard, he reasoned, had both opportunity and motive for a man with debts, ambitions, and an ill-disguised impatience for the duties of Rosewood. Miss Marple, who had lived too long to believe in tidy conclusions, watched the mounting certainty with her usual quiet detachment. She was seen on the village green, knitting serenely while Mrs. Chittenden recounted in great detail how she had once observed Leonard Marchmont handling money much too carelessly at the fete, as though it were water and not coins at all. To Mrs. Chittenden, such extravagance naturally linked itself to desperation, and desperation, she implied, often ended in crime. At the post office, Miss Pole reported breathlessly that Leonard had been seen in Oxford some weeks earlier, dining with a man of dubious reputation. "A publisher," they said, she announced, "but everyone knows publishers are worse than lawyers when it comes to secrets." Reverend Pritchard added a sermon-like reminder of how the sins of the nephew could tarnish the aunt, though he was careful to commend Lady Marchmont's dignity in sorrow. Lydia Gray, notebook in hand, pronounced that Leonard's restless movements and practiced charm bore all the signs of a guilty man attempting to disguise his conscience. Through it all, Miss Marple nodded gently, adding a word here and there, though never one that might pin suspicion too firmly. She had observed, over years of teas and trifles, that gossip needed no encouragement. It bloomed on its own like bindweed, choking the truth unless carefully pruned. What mattered was to listen, to note the small inconsistencies that sprouted in its midst. Meanwhile, Leonard himself bore the weight of attention with a brittle composure. He was seen striding across the village street, his head held higher than usual, his smile just a little too sharp. At the grocer's, he insisted on carrying his own parcels, though he nearly dropped them in his haste. In the evenings he shut himself in Rosewood's study, poring over letters with an air of agitation, and more than one servant whispered that his footsteps could be heard pacing long after the rest of the house was still. Lady Marchmont grew more strained each day. She received visitors with unfailing politeness, but no longer lingered in conversation. More than once she was heard murmuring, "Leonard must be patient. Leonard must not excite himself." It was the kind of refrain that only inflamed speculation further. A household under pressure was a household stripped of its privacy, and every word spoken at Rosewood seemed to echo across the village by supper time. Inspector Crail called at Miss Marple's cottage one afternoon, his manner unusually brisk. He accepted a cup of tea but waved away the offered biscuits. "It's Leonard Marchmont, no doubt about it," he declared. Fennel had something on him. Something to do with money, most likely. Too much borrowing, too many shady acquaintances. Leonard couldn't risk being exposed. A quarrel, a blow with the paperweight. There you have it. Miss Marple, pouring milk into her tea, gave a small sigh. "It does seem straightforward when you put it so. And yet, Inspector, I wonder you wonder what, madam?" His pencil hovered, as though even her musings might be evidence. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether a man as clever as Leonard fancies himself to be would choose to quarrel in the middle of a crowded party, with windows open and guests nearby. Men who intend mischief usually prefer to be unseen. And though I am sure Leonard has many faults, he does strike me as cautious in that regard." Crail frowned, unused to having his certainties disturbed. "Cautious, maybe, but tempers flare. Even the cautious lose their heads." "That is very true," Miss Marple agreed, nodding placidly. "Only sometimes do Inspector tempers flare in ways that look deliberate afterward. It is a curious thing." He harumphed but made no further reply, perhaps deciding that pursuing her meaning would only draw him deeper into the nettles of her reasoning. He left soon after, muttering about statements and ledgers. That evening, as the lamps flickered in cottage windows and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple, Miss Marple took a quiet walk past Rosewood. The house loomed, stately and watchful, its library windows dark. She paused at the gate, listening. The faintest sound drifted on the night air, a woman's voice raised in distress, quickly hushed. She continued home without altering her step, but her mind kept hold of that sound like a burr on wool. The following morning brought another stir. Mrs. Weatherby, flushed with excitement, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage carrying a folded newspaper. "Jane, you must hear this," she exclaimed. "They've found evidence." The inspector himself said so. A note Mr. Fennel had written Leonard's name in his ledger beside some large figure. Debt, they say. Debt of the worst kind. Miss Marple accepted the paper and scanned the modest column. Indeed, the report hinted that financial dealings of a questionable nature had come to light, connecting Leonard to a sum that could not be accounted for. To the villagers, this was proof enough. Leonard Marchmont had been cornered by the librarian, and in desperation, he had silenced him. Yet as Miss Marple folded the paper, her thoughts lingered not on Leonard but on the librarian himself. Ambrose Fennel had been a man of routine, careful and methodical. If he had discovered some damning evidence, would he have left it lying openly in a ledger, waiting to be found by others, or would he, true to his nature, have concealed it where only the attentive might stumble upon it? Later that day, Leonard was seen walking into the village square, Inspector Crail close at his heels. The sight drew a crowd, as such spectacles always did. Villagers paused mid-errand, eyes wide with expectation. Leonard faced them with a defiant expression, though his skin was pale beneath the bravado. "I am not a murderer," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the square. "Mr. Fennel's death was a misfortune, nothing more. Whatever he kept in his ledgers, it does not prove I harmed him." Some turned away, embarrassed by his public protest. Others leaned in, whispering fiercely. Captain Ellison muttered to the baker that such declarations were as good as confessions. Miss Pole clutched her shawl tighter, convinced that danger stalked their very streets. Lydia Gray scribbled furiously in her notebook, eager to preserve every word for her story. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the gathering, studied Leonard's face as he spoke. The anger there was real enough, but beneath it lay something else. Fear, yes, but not the fear of a man who had been killed. It was the fear of being cornered, of being accused of a deed he had not committed, yet being unable to prove otherwise. The distinction was subtle, but to Miss Marple it was as clear as daylight. As the crowd dispersed, she returned to her cottage and set down her knitting. She had seen enough in her long years to know that suspicion, once planted, rarely needed water to grow. Leonard Marchmont might be the obvious suspect and perhaps even the convenient one, but human nature was seldom so obliging. Someone else in Much Woodham, she felt sure, had profited by the village's eagerness to condemn him. And if Leonard was not the guilty one, then somewhere among the tangled threads of gossip and fur lay the truth that Ambrose Fennel had glimpsed too late and paid for with his life. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly in the quiet. Outside, the village buzzed with certainty, but she knew the story was far from finished. The real culprit was still among them, carefully hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next turn of the wheel. The morning mist had scarcely lifted from the hedgerows when Miss Marple walked to the post office, her basket on her arm as though she intended only to purchase stamps and perhaps exchange a word with Miss Pole. Yet her eyes, alert behind her spectacles, were fixed not upon errands but upon the currents that swirled through the village like unseen water. For 3 days now, the villagers had spoken of little else but Leonard Marchmont. Each whispered conversation, each speculative glance, added to the growing conviction that he was guilty. Yet Miss Marple had long ago learned that when an entire village agrees too easily, it is often because the true explanation lies somewhere no one wishes to look. Miss Pole was already at the counter, recounting to the postmistress how Leonard's boots had been seen muddied after the garden party. "It means he left the path," she declared, "and what does one leave the path for, if not to conceal something?" Miss Marple listened quietly, her face betraying nothing. When Miss Pole departed, she asked for a halfpenny stamp and slipped it into her purse, though she had no letter to send. It was her habit to make small purchases when her true purpose was observation. That way, she reasoned, she never appeared to intrude. As she walked back along the lane, her thoughts returned to the library and to the note Ambrose Fennel had left behind, his ledger entries, the missing card, and the brass paperweight that had been so curiously out of place. Details, each of them, but not yet a pattern. Then she remembered something Mrs. Bunn had whispered, that Leonard had been seen with the paperweight in his hand. Yet when the inspector examined the object, he had remarked upon its polished surface, free of any smear or stain. Was it not peculiar that a heavy brass ornament, supposedly wielded in haste, should have been so very clean? Miss Marple's instincts urged her to look again at the scene. And so, later that afternoon, she accepted Lady Marchmont's invitation to tea at Rosewood. Lady Marchmont, pale but composed, greeted her in the drawing-room where roses in porcelain vases gave off a faint perfume. Leonard was absent, which seemed to relieve his aunt. "I asked you," Lady Marchmont confessed, "because I cannot bear the whispering. Leonard is hot-tempered, I know, but murder, he is not capable of it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I often find that when one is surrounded by whispers, the kindest thing to do is to sit quite still until they pass. But perhaps you might indulge me with another look at the library." Lady Marchmont hesitated, then rang for Mrs. Bunn, who led the way with obvious nervousness. The room appeared unchanged since Miss Marple's last visit, with shelves heavy with books, the tall window patched with a temporary board, and the desk orderly. Yet Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the rug that stretched across the floor. She bent slowly, her fingers brushing the fringe. "Curious," she murmured. "Do you see, Mrs. Bunn? The fringe here is crushed, as though something heavy rested upon it, something that has since been moved." Mrs. Bunn peered anxiously. "I never noticed, ma'am. But then, I do not like to linger in this room." Miss Marple's eyes moved to the hearth. A small, dark smudge marked the edge of the stone, half hidden behind the fender. She touched it lightly with her handkerchief and found a faint trace of soot, though the fire had not been lit for weeks. "Another little thing," she said softly, more to herself than to the others. Lady Marchmont looked bewildered. "Do these marks mean anything?" "They mean only that Mr. Fennel's fall may not have been where it seemed. People seldom collapse in quite the tidy fashion we imagine. Something has been shifted, I think, to make the room appear more ordinary." Before Lady Marchmont could reply, the door opened and Leonard himself entered. He started upon seeing Miss Marple crouched near the rug. "Still searching for mysteries, Miss Marple." His smile was tight. "I suppose the village expects you to discover me as a villain." Miss Marple rose with unhurried dignity. "The village expects many things, Mr. Marchmont, but truth has a way of disappointing expectations." Leonard laughed sharply and strode to the window, his back turned to them. Truth or invention, it is all the same once gossip takes hold. They have already convicted me. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then allowed the matter to drop. It was not her habit to accuse without certainty, and certainty was not yet within her grasp. That evening, back in her cottage, she considered the smudge of soot and the crushed rug fringe. They were small things, easily overlooked, yet they suggested that someone had moved the scene after Fennel's death, arranging it for appearances. The question was why? If Leonard had struck in a fit of temper, would he have taken such care to disguise the aftermath? Or was there another hand at work, quieter and more deliberate? As she pondered, a knock came at her door. It was Lydia Gray, notebook in hand, her eyes bright with excitement. "Miss Marple, you must hear what I've learned. Mrs. Chittenden swears she saw Mr. Fennel visiting Reverend Pritchard late one evening, only a week ago. They spoke in hushed tones, and she says the Reverend looked pale as death afterward." Miss Marple received this calmly. "And what do you make of it, my dear? That the Reverend was hiding something, of course. Perhaps Fennel threatened to expose a scandal in the parish." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It may be so. But remember, my dear Lydia, that people often look pale in the lamplight, and whispers are sometimes only prayers. Lydia looked disappointed, but she dutifully wrote down the remark in her notebook, convinced it contained some veiled wisdom. When Lydia had gone, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. Each detail, Leonard's restlessness, Mrs. Bunn's fears, the reverend's late night that the reverend was hiding something, of course. Perhaps Fennel threatened to expose a scandal in the parish. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It may be so. But remember, my dear Lydia, that people often look pale in the lamplight, and whispers are sometimes only prayers. Lydia looked disappointed, but she dutifully wrote down the remark in her notebook, convinced it contained some veiled wisdom. When Lydia had gone, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. Each detail, Leonard's restlessness, Mrs. Bunn's fears, the reverend's late-night meeting, and the smudge by the hearth was like a stitch in a growing pattern. The pattern was not yet clear, but she could feel its outline forming beneath her fingers. The following morning, a new revelation disturbed the village. Captain Ellison, who seldom spoke without gravity, declared at the bakery that he had seen someone near the library on the night after the death. A figure slipping in through the side door, he said, while the house slept. Tall, cloaked. Not Leonard. I'd wager this was thinner and moved with a different gait. The smudge by the hearth was like a stitch in a growing pattern. The pattern was not yet clear, but she could feel its outline forming beneath her fingers. The following morning, a new revelation disturbed the village. Captain Ellison, who seldom spoke without gravity, declared at the bakery that he had seen someone near the library on the night after the death. A figure slipping in through the side door, he said, while the house slept. Tall, cloaked. Not Leonard. I'd wager this was thinner and moved with a different gait. The story spread at once, igniting speculation. If another had entered the library in the night, what had they sought? Papers? Records? Or something more dangerous? Miss Marple listened to the tale with the same calm interest she gave to recipes and weather forecasts. To most, it was merely another puzzle piece thrown into the air, but to her, it confirmed a suspicion already forming that Ambrose Fennel's death had stirred deeper waters than anyone had guessed. Someone, unseen and unsuspected, had risked returning to the library under cover of night. And it was seldom the innocent who crept so cautiously where death had fallen. That evening, as the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and glanced at the small scrap of cloth she had taken from the library, her handkerchief bearing the faint smudge of soot. She placed it in her sewing basket, where it nestled among spools of thread and buttons. To anyone else, it looked like nothing at all. But to her, it was a clear, hidden clue that pointed away from Leonard Marchmont and toward a culprit who had taken great care to arrange appearances. She sat back, thoughtful. The game, she knew, had only just begun. And in much Woodham, where everyone watched everyone else, the most dangerous truths were always hidden in plain sight. The discovery of Captain Ellison's midnight sighting had breathed new life into village speculation. For days the talk had circled relentlessly around Leonard Marchmont, but now it spread like wildfire in new directions. A cloaked figure slipped into Rosewood Library after Fennel's death. Who could it have been, and why? Suddenly, the circle of suspicion widened to include almost everyone in Much Woodham. At the bakery, Mrs. Chittenden insisted it must have been Reverend Pritchard. Who else goes about in a long cloak? She demanded, dusting flour from her apron as she handed a loaf to Miss Pole. Parsons always has cloaks, and wasn't it only last week that Ambrose Fennel called on him after dark? Mark my words, the Reverend is hiding something under his cassock. Miss Pole, ever eager to embellish, leaned closer. And they say the Reverend has been keeping odd hours, slipping out into the church at night. It's enough to give one the shivers. Meanwhile, Lydia Gray had filled 2 more notebooks with theories. She took to cornering anyone who would listen, from the butcher's boy to Lady Marchmont herself, breathlessly describing her latest imagined twists. "It is obvious," she told Mrs. Weatherby, "that Fennel discovered a scandal in the parish registers, perhaps an illegitimate child or a misappropriation of funds. The reverend feared exposure, and so well one can imagine the rest." Mrs. Weatherby frowned. "One can imagine far too much, Lydia. We mustn't leap to conclusions. It is always better to wait until the facts are settled." But Lydia had no patience for waiting. To her mind, every whispered word was inspiration, every passing look a hidden motive. Miss Marple, watching her scribble on the village green, thought privately that Lydia's imagination might prove more dangerous than anyone's secrets, for it fanned suspicion without regard for truth. The Reverend himself did little to quell the gossip. He seemed distracted, his sermons rambling, his eyes often fixed on some unseen point. When Miss Marple greeted him after morning service, he started like a man caught in mischief. "Good heavens, Miss Marple," he stammered. "You have the lightest tread of anyone I know." Quite startled me. "I'm so sorry," Miss Marple said kindly. "One does not mean to intrude, but I hope you are keeping well. The village is so unsettled just now." The Reverend gave a thin smile. Yes, unsettled. But we must trust that matters will come to their proper conclusion. In God's time, you know. In God's time." Miss Marple nodded, but she noticed how his hand tightened on the rail of the lich gate, the knuckles white. It was not the gesture of a man at peace. At Rosewood, tension was no less apparent. Leonard bore the weight of suspicion poorly. He snapped at the servants, paced the corridors, and was overheard declaring that he would leave for London if matters did not soon resolve. Lady Marchmont, in turn, grew sharper with him, her patience thinning. One afternoon, their quarrel spilled into the open drawing-room, where Miss Marple, seated politely with her tea, became an unintended witness. Leonard's voice rose, edged with desperation. "I will not stay here to be gossiped about like some petty thief. Better to be gone than live under this roof, branded with murder." Lady Marchmont's reply was steady but cold. "You will stay, Leonard. To run away would be to admit guilt, and I will not have Rosewood disgraced further. Whatever has passed, we shall meet it here." Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, looked down at the steady click of her needles as though she had heard nothing at all. Yet she had observed everything. The trembling in Leonard's voice, the rigid set of Lady Marchmont's shoulders, and the flicker of fear that crossed her eyes. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was a curious thing. It could belong to the guilty, but just as often it belonged to those who held secrets not meant to be spoken. Later that week, another confrontation stirred the village. Captain Ellison, never one to hold his tongue, encountered Reverend Pritchard outside the churchyard. The two men spoke in low tones at first, but their voices soon carried. "You can preach as you like." "Pritchard," the captain barked, "but I saw the shape of that figure, and I'd stake my service record that you were skulking at Rosewood." The Reverend flushed deeply. "I was nowhere near Rosewood that night. How dare you suggest such a thing? My business is with God, not with murder." "Business with God at midnight?" Ellison sneered. "A convenient hour for those who don't want to be seen." Miss Marple, passing by with her parasol, paused just long enough to hear the words. She greeted them both pleasantly, remarking only that the roses by the church wall were particularly fine this season, then continued on her way. But she stored the quarrel in her mind, another piece in the growing pattern. That evening, Mrs. Bunn slipped quietly into Miss Marple's cottage, twisting her hands in her apron. "I can't keep it to myself, ma'am," she whispered. "There's something I never told you. The night before Mr. Fennel died, I saw Lady Marchmont in the library, speaking to him. Her ladyship looked as though she'd lost all her colour, and Mr. Fennel said something sharp about not being able to keep things hidden forever. She left in a hurry after that. Miss Marple listened intently, her face calm. "You were wise not to repeat such a thing hastily, Mrs. Bunn, but now that you have told me, we must consider what it means. Secrets in houses like Rosewood often grow like ivy. They cling to walls for years, and when they are pulled down, they leave marks." Mrs. Bunn nodded miserably. "I don't want to see her ladyship shamed, but I couldn't keep it back any longer." After the maid had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire. Piece by piece the picture sharpened. Leonard's debts, the reverend's unease, Lady Marchmont's mysterious quarrel, and Captain Ellison's suspicions all pointed in different directions. Yet the threads twined together around one figure, Ambrose Fennel, the quiet librarian who seemed to know too much about everyone. He had carried their secrets in his ledgers and his memory, and for that he had been struck down. But who among them had been most desperate to silence him? That was the question, and it was not one to be answered by gossip or anger, but by the small, unguarded things people let slip when pressed. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following day, Miss Marple encountered Lady Marchmont in the garden. The lady looked weary, her face pale against the lavender of her gown. Miss Marple complimented the roses, then added gently, "It must be difficult, Lady Marchmont, to have the library spoken of in such a way. A room full of memories now touched by tragedy." Lady Marchmont stiffened. "Yes, difficult indeed, but we must bear what we must." Miss Marple's gaze was kind but steady. Mr. Fennel was a man who valued records. He kept careful account of what others might wish forgotten. Sometimes such knowledge is a burden. I think he tried to share that burden with you. For a moment, Lady Marchmont's composure faltered. Her lips trembled, and her eyes filled with something like dread. But she recovered swiftly, turning the conversation back to the weather. Miss Marple did not press her. It was not yet time. That evening, the village hummed with more rumors than ever. Leonard remained the favorite suspect, but now others were whispering about the reverend with his cloaked figure, Lady Marchmont with her pale distress, and even Captain Ellison, who seemed far too eager to point elsewhere. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking. Confrontations had stripped away the surface politeness of much Woodham, exposing the tangle of fear, resentment, and secrets beneath. She knew the murderer was watching as keenly as she was, weighing each new suspicion, waiting to see where it would settle. But Miss Marple also knew something the murderer did not, that human nature, once stirred, could never quite be hidden again. It always betrayed itself, sometimes in the smallest, quietest ways. The summer sun returned with unexpected brilliance the morning after Lady Marchmont's unguarded moment in the garden, as though determined to mock the shadows gathering in much Woodham. Children played in the lanes, their laughter oddly at odds with the tense murmurs that passed from house to house. Suspicion still pressed heavily upon Leonard Marchmont, yet the air felt unsettled, as if something more were waiting to happen. It came in the form of a shout that startled the village out of its calm breakfast. Peter Jupp, the Marchmonts' under-gardener, had burst into the square, face flushed, calling that there had been another discovery at Rosewood. Something hidden in the library that proved the affair was far from over. By mid-morning, Inspector Crail was back at Rosewood with Constable Reed in tow, while villagers clustered near the gates, unwilling to be kept from the latest morsel. Miss Marple, arriving with deliberate composure, was admitted quietly through the side door. She found the inspector standing grimly beside the library desk, holding up an envelope for all to see. "Found tucked beneath the false bottom of the drawer," Crail announced, his voice thick with satisfaction, "and written in Mr. Fennel's hand. A letter addressed, no less, to Lady Marchmont." Lady Marchmont, pale as the paper itself, sat rigid in her chair. Her hands twisted the edge of her handkerchief, but her eyes remained steady on the inspector. "May I hear its contents?" she asked. Crail cleared his throat and read aloud. Madame, I can no longer conceal the truth of the matter. What I have discovered must, for the sake of conscience, be revealed. If you do not act, I shall be compelled to speak. Yours in duty, Ambrose Fennel. He let the words hang in the heavy air. Damning, wouldn't you say? He threatened her ladyship directly. The room stirred with shock. Even Leonard, usually quick with a retort, seemed momentarily silenced. He glanced at his aunt with something between fear and anger, his expression betraying the suspicion he had tried to suppress. Miss Marple's eyes, however, lingered on the envelope. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed." Crail frowned. "What's curious about a confession of intent?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Oh, nothing at all, except that Mr. Fennel's hand was usually so precise, so tidy. One grows used to certain characteristics in a person's script. Yet this appears oddly hurried, does it not? As though written by someone imitating his style, but in too great a haste." Crail harumphed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "It will be examined, of course. Still, the meaning is plain enough." Leonard stepped forward suddenly. "This is ridiculous. If Ambrose accused my aunt of anything, it was nonsense. She has nothing to hide." Lady Marchmont turned on him with unexpected sharpness. "Be silent, Leonard. I will not be defended like a child. If Ambrose wrote that letter, then he believed he knew something. But belief is not truth." Miss Marple observed quietly, noting how the lady's voice trembled despite her outward control. Secrets often trembled at the edges before they broke. The inspector departed soon after, taking the letter with him, but by evening the whole village buzzed with the news. At the bakery, Mrs. Chittenden declared that Lady Marchmont must have been hiding a scandal dating back years, an illegitimate child, or worse, a muddled inheritance. Miss Pole whispered of blackmail. Reverend Pritchard, when pressed, shook his head solemnly and muttered that even the righteous may be tested. Lydia Gray scribbled with fevered delight, convinced she now had the perfect climax for her novel. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced, a letter discovered so conveniently, hidden in a false bottom that even Mrs. Bunn had never mentioned. It seemed too neat, too perfectly suited to shift suspicion. She had seen many such tricks in her time. They worked best on those eager for resolution, but less so on those who watched for the untidy corners. The following day brought an even darker twist. Shortly before noon, a scream echoed across the Marchmont grounds. Servants rushed toward the sound, and within minutes the dreadful truth emerged. Reverend Pritchard had been found collapsed in the vestry of St. Mary's, unconscious beside an open Bible. Dr. Hadley, summoned at once, shook his head gravely. "Poison," he announced. "Not enough to kill, thank God, but enough to lay him low." The news spread through much Woodham faster than fire on a dry hedge. Poison, a second crime, surely connected to the first. Some whispered that the Reverend had attempted to silence himself, burdened by guilt. Others swore that whoever had killed Ambrose Fennel now sought to remove a second obstacle. The village, already unsettled, grew restless with fear. Miss Marple, visiting the church that afternoon, found the Reverend pale and trembling in his bed, his breath shallow. He managed to whisper, "I meant no harm. I only wished to protect the flock." His eyes darted toward the small table beside him, where a flask of communion wine stood half empty. Miss Marple bent closer, noting the faint, bitter scent that clung to the rim. She spoke gently. "Sometimes, Reverend, the greatest harm is done by silence. Secrets weigh heavily when kept too long." He turned his face away, unable to answer, and soon drifted into an uneasy sleep. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, considering the new developments. In the letter to Lady Marchmont, the Reverend collapses two events in quick succession, both seemingly designed to divert suspicion. It was a clever ploy, yet perhaps too clever. She thought again of the soot smudge by the hearth, the crushed fringe of the rug, and the missing record card. Little things, each of them but far less contrived than a conveniently discovered letter. The murderer, she reflected, was weaving a net of false leads, hoping the inspector and the villagers would exhaust themselves chasing shadows. But Miss Marple knew that truth did not hide in grand gestures. It lurked in the small, stubborn facts that resisted explanation. As she set her knitting aside for the night, a knock came at her door. It was Captain Ellison, his cane striking the threshold with urgency. "Miss Marple," he said gruffly, "I thought you ought to know. Last evening, just before the reverend was taken ill, I saw a figure again near the library. Same cloak, same careful step. Not Leonard, I swear it. Whoever it was, they meant to come back." Miss Marple thanked him with her usual calm, but inside she felt a quiet certainty stir. Another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. The murderer's mask was slipping, if only slightly. And soon, she thought, they would make a mistake that could not be smoothed away. For now, though, the village of Much Woodham shivered with the knowledge that the affair at Rosewood was no longer a single tragedy. A second crime had shaken their complacency, and no one felt safe from suspicion. Miss Marple, sitting in her little cottage with the lamplight pooling on her knitting, reflected that human nature was never so revealing as when it tried desperately to conceal itself. The attempted poisoning of Reverend Pritchard cast a pall over Much Woodham deeper than even Ambrose Fennell's death. One death might still be explained away by chance or sudden illness, but two attacks, both involving men who seemed to know more than they should, pointed unmistakably to deliberate malice. The villagers, once merely curious, now glanced at one another with genuine unease. Suspicion had widened, stretching like a net, and no one could say who might be caught in it next. Inspector Crail grew irritable under the strain. His once firm conviction that Leonard Marchmont was guilty wavered with the Reverend's collapse, though he would not admit as much aloud. Instead, he stomped through the village with a thunderous expression, demanding statements and muttering darkly about outside influences. Yet in his heart he knew the danger lay within the village itself. He saw shadows in every corner, but could not make them form a clear shape. Miss Marple, in contrast, remained composed, watching with the quiet patience that had long been her strength. She had observed how each new revelation unsettled the suspects. Lady Marchmont retreating further into silence, Leonard lashing out in defiance, Captain Ellison bristling with self-righteousness, and Lydia Gray scribbling with feverish delight as though the whole affair were a novel unfolding for her benefit. Each reaction was telling, but none was conclusive. It was time, Miss Marple decided, for a little test that relied not on evidence or confession, but on human nature itself. She had often found that people, when confronted with a small and carefully chosen prod, revealed more than they intended. A guilty conscience might be hidden under charm or bluster, but it seldom withstood the pressure of a needle pricking just the right place. The opportunity presented itself when Lady Marchmont invited a handful of villagers to Rosewood for tea. She claimed it was to calm nerves and restore normality, though most saw it as an attempt to quiet the whispers against her family. Miss Marple accepted at once. Such gatherings, she knew, were fertile ground for observing reactions. People often betrayed themselves more at tea than under oath. The guests assembled in the drawing-room, Lady Marchmont presiding with fragile dignity, Leonard standing at her side like a soldier on guard, Reverend Pritchard pale but determined to show his face, Lydia Gray clutching her notebook with poorly disguised eagerness, Captain Ellison stiff in his chair, and Mrs. Weatherby, who had come out of loyalty to Miss Marple more than anything else. Miss Marple herself sat near the fire, her knitting in her lap, her eyes twinkling as though she were no more than a harmless old lady content to listen. Conversation at first was strained, drifting from the weather to the state of the roses, then faltering into awkward silences. It was clear that each guest was waiting for the others to speak, fearful of saying too much. Lady Marchmont poured tea with a trembling hand, while Leonard supplied cake with forced joviality. Only Lydia spoke freely, speculating on hidden motives and daring escapes until Lady Marchmont cut her off with a firm, "That will do, my dear." It was then that Miss Marple chose her moment. She set down her cup and looked around with mild curiosity. "I have been thinking," she said softly, "about the night poor Mr. Fennel died. So many little things puzzle me still. For instance, that smudge of soot by the hearth. Such a curious place for soot when no fire had been lit. It makes one wonder what might have been dropped there and hastily retrieved." Her words, spoken with the air of idle musing, landed like stones in still water. Lady Marchmont's spoon clinked sharply against her saucer. Leonard shifted, his jaw tightening. Reverend Pritchard bowed his head, muttering something about mysterious ways. Captain Ellison frowned deeply, but it was Lydia Gray whose reaction stood out. Her pencil snapped in her hand, and she flushed crimson before attempting a laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, you do notice the oddest things." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "It is only a habit, my dear. One sees so many small details when one knits. Dropped stitches, crumbs on a cushion, smudges where they ought not to be. They are of no importance unless, of course, they form part of a pattern." Lydia busied herself with her notebook, but Miss Marple did not press the point. Instead, she let the conversation drift back to safer topics. Yet she had seen what she needed to see. Reactions told their own stories, and Lydia's startled response was not that of a disinterested observer. It was the response of someone who felt the prick of danger. Later, as the guests departed, Miss Marple lingered near the door, speaking quietly to Mrs. Weatherby. "Did you notice, my dear, how restless Lydia was? Her eagerness to write everything down may not be as innocent as she claims. Writers sometimes take liberties with truth, but there are liberties and liberties." Mrs. Weatherby, flustered, whispered, "You don't mean Lydia, surely not." "She's so young." Miss Marple's smile was kind. "Youth does not prevent one from folly. In fact, it often encourages it." That night, Miss Marple devised a second test. She asked Mrs. Bunn, discreet and loyal, to leave the side door of the library unlatched, and she herself waited quietly in the shadows near the garden. She had reasoned that if someone had returned once to the scene of the crime, they might do so again, especially now that suspicion shifted between so many parties. The guilty often sought to adjust their handiwork when they feared discovery. Sure enough, as the church clock struck 11, a figure approached. Cloaked, cautious, and pausing at every sound, it slipped through the side door and into the library. Miss Marple followed at a careful distance, her steps light, her presence unnoticed. Inside, the figure moved to the desk, pulling open the drawer with nervous haste. Papers rustled. Then came the sound of something striking the floor, a brass paperweight hastily dropped. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "So it is you." The figure froze, then turned. In the lamplight, the cloak fell back to reveal not Leonard, as many had long assumed, but Lydia Gray. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and defiance. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It isn't what it looks like." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "It seldom is. But human nature, my dear, is rather more difficult to disguise. You have been writing your novel in earnest, I see, but you have written yourself into the story more than you intended." Lydia trembled, clutching the edge of the desk. For a moment, she looked as though she might confess then and there. But instead, she pushed past Miss Marple and fled into the night, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Miss Marple did not follow. She had learned long ago that truth, once cornered, would return of its own accord. People could not run forever from themselves. She returned to her cottage, thoughtful. The test had worked, and Lydia had revealed herself. though not yet her reasons. There were still pieces missing: Lady Marchmont's secret, Leonard's debts, and the reverend's fears, but the pattern was nearly complete. Soon it would be time to gather the threads and show them for what they were. For now, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Outside, the village slept uneasily, unaware that the net was tightening and the final revelation was close at hand. The day chosen for the gathering at Rosewood was overcast, the sky a low ceiling of grey that seemed to press down upon the village. Lady Marchmont had agreed, with some reluctance, to allow Miss Marple the use of the drawing-room. It was not her habit to give over her house to what she considered theatre, but something in Miss Marple's quiet insistence had persuaded her. Perhaps, too, she was weary of the endless speculation that had eaten away at the dignity of Rosewood. By mid-afternoon, the principal figures of Much Woodham assembled. Inspector Crail arrived with his usual air of disgruntled authority. Leonard with nervous defiance, the Reverend still pale from his ordeal, Captain Ellison stiff and watchful, Lydia Gray clutching her notebook as though it were armour, and Mrs. Weatherby at Miss Marple's side, offering comfort by her mere presence. Lady Marchmont presided silently from her chair, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting basket at her feet. She looked around at the company, her eyes mild, her voice almost apologetic. "I must thank you all for coming. It is never pleasant to speak of such things, but when a village is unsettled, the only kindness is to bring matters into the open. Poor Mr. Fennel would not want his death to cast such shadows." Inspector Crail harumphed. "If you've something to say, madam, best say it plainly. I've no patience for riddles." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then I shall be as plain as I can. From the beginning, it has seemed convenient to believe Leonard Marchmont guilty. He quarrelled with Mr. Fennel, he had debts, and he was restless under suspicion. But convenience, Inspector, is not the same as truth. There were details that did not fit." She paused, letting the silence draw their attention. The smudge of soot by the hearth. The fringe of the rug was crushed as if something heavy had been moved. The brass paperweight, curiously out of place, and a missing record card bearing Leonard's name. These were small things, but they told me that the scene had been altered after Mr. Fennel's death. Leonard shifted uncomfortably, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "I told you I wasn't guilty," he muttered. "Quite so," Miss Marple said gently. "But someone wished to make it appear you were. That someone relied upon the village's willingness to believe the worst of a young man with debts. And when suspicion threatened to turn elsewhere, a letter was discovered, a letter far too convenient, purporting to threaten Lady Marchmont. I have seen Ambrose Fennel's handwriting often enough in his records to know that this was not his natural script. It was an imitation, designed to cast fresh suspicion." Inspector Crail bristled. "Are you saying the letter was forged?" "Yes, Inspector. Forged by someone clever enough to know that the villagers craved a story with drama and scandal. And then, when that still did not suffice, another attempt was made to poison the Reverend's cup, to silence him before he might speak. But here again, it was too neat, too dramatic, too theatrical." Her eyes turned toward Lydia Gray, who sat rigid in her chair, her fingers clenched around her notebook. "You see, my dear Lydia, you have been writing this story as much as living it. Your imagination is fertile, your pen restless. But in trying to weave your tale, you gave yourself away. You knew too much and reacted too quickly. And I saw you myself in the library at night, cloaked and fearful, rummaging through the desk. You dropped the paperweight. You tried to disguise the scene. You forged the letter." Lydia's face was drained of colour. "That is not true," she cried. "I am a writer. I observe. I record. I may have been foolish enough to wander where I should not, but I never killed anyone." Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You forget, my dear, that you told me of the missing record card when no one but the guilty party could have known it was gone. Mrs. Bunn had never mentioned it. The inspector had not seen it. Yet you spoke of it with such certainty. That was when I knew. The notebook slipped from Lydia's trembling hands, scattering pages across the carpet. Words scrawled in her hurried script flew open for all to see, dramatic accounts of the murder, filled with details only the murderer could know. Lady Marchmont gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Leonard rose to his feet, fury and disbelief written across his face. "But why?" he demanded. "Why, Ambrose?" He was nothing. "To you!" Lydia buried her face in her hands, her voice breaking. He laughed at me. Said my writing was childish and that no one would ever publish a word of it. He promised to show me how to research properly, but then he mocked me. I couldn't bear it, and then I found his ledgers, his secrets. I thought I shaped the story. If I controlled it, people would listen. They would remember my name. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. A story, yes. But you chose to make it with another person's life. And once you had begun, you could not stop. You tried to direct suspicion first upon Leonard, then upon Lady Marchmont, then upon the Reverend. But stories written with malice unravel sooner or later. Inspector Crail, red-faced, barked for Constable Reed to gather the papers. Lydia, sobbing, was led away, her cloak slipping from her shoulders like a discarded costume. The room remained heavy with silence after she was gone, each of those present absorbing the shock in their own way. Leonard sat down abruptly, his head in his hands. I thought it was me. I thought it was over. Lady Marchmont laid a hand upon his shoulder, her expression softened by relief and sorrow. Both. It is not over, Leonard, but it is not you. That much at least we may be grateful for. Reverend Pritchard murmured a prayer under his breath, as if seeking to cleanse the air of sin. Captain Ellison scowled, muttering that he had suspected as much all along, though his tone betrayed otherwise. Mrs. Weatherby wept quietly, dabbing her eyes with her handkerchief. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly once more. "The danger is past," she said, "though the hurt may linger. We must remember that Ambrose Fennel, poor man, was only guilty of knowing too much and saying too little. It was not his secrets that destroyed him, but someone else's vanity." She glanced at Lady Marchmont, whose composure was at last beginning to return. "You may find, my dear, that the truth, however painful, is lighter to bear than suspicion. Much of Woodham will settle again in time. It always does." The storm outside broke at last, rain pattering against the tall windows of Rosewood. Within, the tension eased, though unease remained. A murderer had been unmasked, but the village, with its love of gossip and secrets, would take longer to heal. Miss Marple, however, sat content. She had seen human nature in all its frailty once more, and though it saddened her, it also confirmed what she had always known, that the smallest details, the little things, would always betray the truth in the end. The rain that had begun during Miss Marple's revelation continued into the following morning, falling softly over much Woodham, washing dust from the hedgerows and leaving the village damp but cleansed. The air felt different, somehow lighter, though subdued. For the first time since the garden party at Rosewood, there was no new rumor leaping from lips to ears, no frantic guessing at who might be guilty. The story had found its ending, and the village, like a restless child, had at last been told to sit still. Lydia Gray's arrest had shocked even those most given to gossip. That the imaginative young woman who so eagerly scribbled in her notebooks could also wield malice had unsettled the village more than the crime itself. For some, it was easier to believe in the corruption of wealth or the cruelty of temper than to accept that vanity and hurt feelings could drive one to murder. Yet that was human nature. As Miss Marple well knew, it was seldom the obvious motives that proved fatal, but the small, festering wounds of pride and resentment. At the bakery, Mrs. Chittenden declared with solemnity that she had always suspected something not quite steady about Lydia. She wrote too fast, she told her customers, as if she feared her own thoughts would escape. That sort of haste doesn't sit right with me. Miss Pole nodded eagerly, though she had until recently been Lydia's most ardent admirer, claiming she had predicted greatness for the girl. Now she insisted she had meant notoriety, not talent. Captain Ellison maintained that he had mistrusted Lydia's sharp eyes from the start, though no one could recall him ever having mentioned it before. At the vicarage, Reverend Pritchard returned slowly to his duties. Though pale from his brush with poison, he delivered his sermons with renewed gravity, speaking often of vanity, the perils of pride, and the dangers of making idols of oneself. His congregation listened with unusual attention, for the memory of Lydia's flushed face and trembling hands had left a mark. Few could forget that she had woven herself into her own tragedy and been trapped by it. At Rosewood, life resumed with tentative calm. Leonard, though relieved of suspicion, carried the scars of his ordeal. He moved about the village more quietly now, humbled by how quickly a reputation could turn. Lady Marchmont seemed to soften toward him, speaking less sharply and leaning upon his presence with new trust. Rosewood's servants, once anxious and whispering in corners, began to go about their duties again without furtive glances at the library. The house itself, however, retained an air of solemnity, as though the walls remembered too much. One morning, Miss Marple called upon Lady Marchmont for tea. They sat together in the drawing-room where the affair had reached its climax, the rain tapping gently on the tall windows. Lady Marchmont looked weary but composed, her lavender gown neat, her hands folded in her lap. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am, Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Had you not spoken, Leonard might still be under suspicion, or worse. It is a dreadful thought." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I did only what anyone would have done, Lady Marchmont. Anyone with an eye for small things. Leonard was never the guilty one. But suspicion does not need truth to thrive. It needs only fear and convenience." Lady Marchmont sighed. "It is extraordinary, is it not, that such a thing could have been done for vanity alone? Not money, not inheritance, merely the hunger to be admired." "It is very common, I'm afraid," Miss Marple replied. "One need not be greedy for riches to do harm. Some crave attention instead, or the power to shape how others think of them. That can be as strong a temptation as gold, and often more dangerous." They sipped their tea in silence for a time, both women gazing at the rain-streaked glass. At length, Lady Marchmont said, "The library feels changed to me now. I cannot enter it without remembering. Do you think such rooms ever lose their shadows?" Miss Marple considered. "Perhaps not entirely, but shadows soften with time. What lingers is not only the harm, but also the lesson. A room that has seen the truth revealed is seldom worse for it." Meanwhile, the villagers adjusted themselves to life after the scandal. Mrs. Weatherby confessed to Miss Marple that she felt guilty for having whispered against Leonard. "I knew better, Jane," she said with moist eyes. "I knew you would not have spoken if it had been him, and yet I let myself be carried away." Miss Marple patted her hand. "It is human nature, my dear. Villages thrive on stories, and when one grows too exciting, it is easy to forget that it may not be true. We all do it from time to time. What matters is that we learn to pause before believing too readily." For her part, Miss Marple resumed her quiet routines. She tended her garden, mended her lace, and continued her knitting by the hearth. The village, though grateful to her, soon returned to its comfortable habit of overlooking her, seeing only a gentle old woman with needles in her hands. She preferred it so. It was easier to observe human nature when one was thought to be invisible. One evening, as she sat with her knitting, Mrs. Weatherby remarked, "You must find it disheartening, Jane, always seeing the worst side of people." Miss Marple looked up with a faint smile. "On the contrary, my dear. I see the worst, yes, but I see the best as well." People are foolish, vain, selfish, and sometimes cruel, but they are also kind, brave, and capable of change. One cannot exist without the other. It is the mixture that makes us what we are. As the summer ripened into late August, much Woodham regained its rhythm. Children played in the churchyard without fear. Mrs. Chittenden's loaves were once again the chief subject of breakfast conversation, and the library at Rosewood, though quieter now, reopened to visitors. Some spoke of moving on, of putting the tragedy behind them, but Miss Marple knew that human nature does not forget so easily. It carries scars, faint but enduring, reminding us of what we are capable of for good or ill. One afternoon, she walked past the churchyard, where the reverend was tending a patch of roses. He greeted her warmly. His colour returned. "Thanks to you, Miss Marple, truth was served." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not to me, Reverend, to truth itself. I only noticed the little things. It is the truth that always finds a way, no matter how cleverly it is hidden." The bells of St. Mary's chimed as she walked home, their sound gentle and reassuring. The village, for all its gossip and weakness, had survived another shadow. Life at Much Woodham would return to its small dramas and daily rituals, but beneath the surface lay the reminder that even the quietest corners could harbor secrets, and that human pride, however small, could grow deadly if left unchecked. In her cottage, Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and gazed at the fire, her thoughts reflective. Ambrose Fennel had been a quiet man, and his death had revealed not only a murderer, but also the fragile balance of truth and falsehood upon which every community rests. She thought of Lydia Greybright, eager, consumed by the desire to be seen, and she felt no triumph, only sorrow. For it was vanity, not malice alone, that had driven her. And vanity, Miss Marple knew, was among the oldest and most dangerous flaws of human nature. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and the village settled into peace once more. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes soft but steady. The affair at Rosewood Library was finished, but the lessons it left behind would linger in Much Woodham, as lessons always did. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, would continue to see the little things, the unnoticed truths, waiting patiently for the moment they chose to reveal themselves.